Hi everybody, this is Bastiaan, and today we're going to take a look at a variation of the King's Gambit called the Villemson Gambit. And I'm playing white and playing against an engine called Alex 1.78. So the game starts out with e4, e5, f4, the King's Gambit. Black accepts. And now white plays the Villemson Gambit d4. So we're seeing that white reaches one of his opening goals immediately, that is to take control of the center with pawns. However, in doing it so early, white creates a serious weakness with the queen move h4 check, which will force the king to move. After queen h4 check, which was played, there's no defense like pawn to g3, because then simply pawn takes pawn with discovered check and perhaps another attack on the rook. Of course, the pawn cannot be recaptured because of queen takes rook. So after queen to h4 check, white is forced to move the king already. King to e2. Black plays knight to f6, trying to attack the pawn immediately. The in-between move, knight to f3, threatening the queen. Queen moves to g4, pinning the knight. Knight to c3, protecting the pawn. And bishop to b4, and the idea is to exchange on c3, which will leave the pawn on e4 hanging. So the pawn needs to be brought into safety immediately. e5, gaining tempo on the knight. Knight to h5. And now knight to d5. So we're seeing that this bishop isn't pinning anything because the king has moved. And knight to d5 threatens the bishop and threatens a fork on c7. Black covers with knight development, knight to a6, covering the pawn. c3, kicking back the bishop, but also opening up a diagonal for my own queen. Bishop retreats. And queen to a4, free development of white's queen, threatening the bishop. Black plays b6, covering the bishop. Queen to a3, threatening mate. Again, black is forced to move pawns and create weaknesses. Pawn to d6 is played. And now white is having some issues. We're seeing that white's knight on d5 is in an excellent attacking position, but d5 is an unstable square, because black can simply play bishop to b7 or bishop to e6 to chase away the unprotected knight. So if white plays a regular developing move, let's say bishop to d2, we can see that this move is too weak, because after bishop to b7, possible continuation could be knight to b4, retreating the knight. Bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, and black simply castles. And we can see that black is castled into safety, has a better position, and is up a pawn. And white has no attacking potential left. So bishop to d2 is too weak to develop. If white tries something else, like say pawn takes pawn, to open up the e-file for the king, black can simply play queen to e6 check and attack the knight. This doesn't seem to work either. But The rooks cannot be developed because they are blocked by the bishop. So actually there's one option left, that's to develop the bishop on f1. Therefore, the king needs to move. So let's say king moves to d2. Now we can see that white has a development with tempo, with bishop to b5 check. So if bishop to b7, chase away the knight, white can play bishop b5 check, say king d8, then b4, trapping black's bishop. But now we can see some issues for white. Namely, white can take on the pawn on g2, check, and then grab either the rook or knight that are being forked. So if king moves to d2, g2 is hanging. Correct move which was played is king to f2, which frees up the bishop but keeps protecting the g2 pawn. Notice that black cannot castle, because if black tries to castle at this point, white can play knight to e7 check, king moves, knight takes bishop, and although the knight can be recaptured, we can see now that the knight on a6 is hanging. Black will be down a minor piece. So castling isn't possible. Black instead plays bishop to b7, attacking the knight. So now both sides have created an attack. We will see which attack comes first. Bishop b5 check. Notice that the two minor pieces cannot be forked, because if say c6 to fork both pieces and block the check, white can play queen takes pawn, threatening mate, and of course the knight cannot be recaptured because of the pin, so forking the pieces doesn't work. Say pawn takes knight, mate. So after bishop b5 check, black plays king to d8, and his king is on the run. b4 to trap the bishop on a5. So he's saying my knight is hanging and his bishop is hanging. Bishop takes knight. Bishop takes knight on a6. Bishop takes knight again. Pawn takes bishop. Queen h4 check, because the square is no longer covered by the knight. King moves to e2. And knight to g3 check. So we're seeing black creating a strong attack with a fork on g3. And I can recapture the knight on g3, but then the rook on h1 will hang. But that's exactly what was played. Pawn takes knight and queen takes rook. Pawn takes pawn, because white needs an escape for his king. Queen g2 check, king e3, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Queen g1 check, king d2. And finally, black will run out of checks because of the possibility to block with the bishop. So black's bishop is still hanging. Black recaptures a piece, a pawn with it. Queen recaptures. queen f2 check, bishop blocks, and black has run out of checks. Now it's queen and 2 bishops and a rook against queen and 2 rooks, but white is still down in pawns, so material wise the situation is more or less equal, but white does have the better position at this point. Black plays rook to c8, queen a4. Now queen a4 is played to get a strong diagonal for the queen with outposts on b5, c6, and in cases even d7. Whereas on the a3, f8 diagonal, those squares are covered. Notice that leaving the queen on b4 and strengthening the diagonal with bishop to a3 is simpler and probably better. But queen a4 was played, which also works. Rook to e8, rook to the half open file, bishop to a3, so we're creating complementary diagonals. a5, rook to h1, threatening the pawn, and black plays rooks to h8 to cover the pawn. Now notice that h6 is also playable and probably better, but the engine realizes that after queen to c6, threatening queen to d5 check, black has to play a move like rook to e6 and move his rook anyways. Rook d5, an escape is needed. So that's why rook to h8 was played immediately, to create an escape for the king. In this variation, white should continue with queen b5 check. Oh no, he doesn't. White should continue with queen to b7 to attack the rook. Say king to d8, and then simply rook back to b1 with a rook lift. There's not too much that black can do to prevent it. g6, rook to b5. If black tries to cover with pawns, then his defense just falls apart. Check. And there's not much hope for black. So anyways, h6 is definitely possible, but it wasn't played because black realizes he's going to waste moves on moving the rook anyway, so rook to h8 is played. Same idea, queen to c6. Now, if h6 is played at this moment, we get queen to d5 check, king to e8, and then e6, threatening mate, pawn takes pawn, queen takes pawn check, king to d8, queen to e7 mate. So we're seeing black's options already being more and more limited. This rook is blocking the king. So after queen to c6, black decides to play rook to b8, simply to create more escape for the king. Bishop e7 check, sacrificing the bishop or offering the bishop, but the bishop cannot be taken because if king takes bishop, we get queen takes pawn check. Then if king to e6 for instance, queen d6 check, king f5, rook h5 check, and say g5, queen to f6 mate, or king to f4. Then the pawn advance e6 is also made. Alternatively, if black takes, check, and the king moves to e8, then we can get queen takes rook check, threatening the loss of both rooks. But even worse, it's also made with the combination of the pawn island and the queen. Pawn to d6, checkmate. So white plays bishop to e7 check, offering up the bishop, and the bishop cannot be taken, because then every continuation will be made for black. King to c8 instead is played. So black uses his escape squares to bring the king into safety. And now an arrogant move. Rook takes pawn, gaining a pawn and attacking the rook. Black recaptures the rook on h7, but since we are on a king hunt, we can get away with some seemingly wild moves. The main purpose of rook takes pawn on h7 is to remove this rook from the defense on the 8th rank. So bishop to d6, threatening mate. Of course, the pawn cannot recapture the bishop because of the queen. And black realizes he's mated. He plays some in-between sacrifices. Queen takes bishop, king recaptures, so we're seeing typical engine moves. Rook h2 check, king h3, rook e2 check, king recaptures. So we're back to the mate threat, with all in-between moves gone. Two options: if rook to b7, then simply queen to e8 mate, and this is why the rook needed to move. To counter the defense of rook to b7. Only other move is king to d8, leading to a mate in one more move. Queen takes pawn on c7 check, king e8, queen e7 mate. So that's my game with Villemson Gambit against the Alex chess engine. I hope you enjoyed watching it. Please leave a comment and have a great evening.